This week we're moving on to functions. So functions are kind of going to be kind of the big stepping stone and kind of the tool that's going to allow you to unlock a lot more here in Python. So your different containers, such as lists and dictionaries, they give you a lot of power. Your loops are going to give you a lot more power in terms of iterating through data containers, but functions are kind of the first step in the process of being able to kind of create something new that can be kind of utilized in other ways. So functions are one step. Classes, which we'll get to in a few weeks, is kind of the big step when you're getting into like towards object-oriented programming. The interesting thing is that you've already used functions in this class. So when you import a package such as random or a package such as math or packages that you'll import throughout the course and throughout your time using Python, you will you will encounter that a lot of the things you're calling from that package are functions. So like if you were doing square root, so let's say you're doing square root, so you can say import math and then do math dot square root of x. So if we have square root, if x is 5, we take math dot square root. Well, square root is actually a function built into the math package. So basically, if you were to open up the math package, you would see that they define square root and there's some sort of input, and then the input is the variable, which is what we put in here. And then it basically runs through the iterative process of calculating the square root of 5 because x is 5 here. And so it spits it out. Same thing with like rounding numbers off. That's the inputs are the variable and the number of numbers you want it to round off to, and then the function is basically manipulating that data so it spits out your desired outcome. If you want to create a function for yourself, though, what you're going to do is you're going to use this DEF. So you're basically defining the function. You're going to give it a name, and then you're going to identify and name a certain set of inputs. So you could have one input, you could have two inputs, you could have 500 inputs. But what you're going to do in the function is it's going to take the information that you have put in the inputs, and then it's going to run through whatever programming and coding you have within the function, and then it's either going to print out results or it's going to return results. So in this function, what we have is I'm defining add numbers. So add numbers is going to be a new function that I've created. It's going to take two inputs. It's going to take the input of x and it's going to take the input of y. Now, when I say x and y, this doesn't mean that I have to have already defined x the variable and y the variable. So if you look at my screen, you can see that I have x equals 5 and I have y equals 7. Okay? So, so you can see I've defined x and y, but that doesn't mean that your function won't work if you only have z and q or something like that. You don't have to literally define x and y for this to work. It's just saying that I'm taking an input and I'm calling it x, and I'm taking an input and calling it y. And then inside of the function, what I do is whatever I want to do to x and whatever I want to do to y in terms of data manipulation, I'm going to use whatever variable for that thing, and I'm going to use whatever variable for that thing. So in this one, it's very simple, but once we do more complicated stuff, it'll make a little bit more sense. In this one, the add numbers function is just taking the two inputs and adding them together. So x is one of the inputs, y is the other input. It's just adding them together and it's returning that value. So since we've And so what I will do is if I want to run that function, so defining it just basically creates it and it waits for you to call that function. So just like I imported math, it made square root available, but it wasn't actually put into implementation until I called the square root function and put some sort of variable in there so it could do the mathematical operation on it. So in this case, since I've already defined the variable x and the variable y, when I say add numbers of x and y, it's saying that I'm adding in my first input is the variable x and my second input is the variable y. And what it's going to do is it's going to take that first input, add it to the second input, and return that value. So since x is 5 and y is 7, we should get 12. But if I redefine x as z and I redefine y as q, okay, and I change this to z and q, even though they're not called x and y, I'm going to get the same answer. Why? Because the first input is just the input, and the second input is the input, and then inside of the function, you are telling it what to do. So even though it's not literally named x and y, it's named z and q, it's going to take whatever I put in here and put in here and add it together so long as it's compatible. So if it's two floats, it'll add it together and give you a float. If it's two integers, it'll add those together, give you two integers. Now, what if we change this to strings? Do you think that this is going to work or not? Do you think it's going to concatenate, or do you think it's just going to give me an error? Sorry, I'm trying to see if the chat is open. Well, let's try it anyway. I don't know why it's not. Oh, I know why, because I have to run it. There we go. Ta-da! It concatenates. So even though I have this as defining as add numbers, remember that string, if you put a string and you concatenate, or you put a plus there, it'll concatenate. So it actually took hello and world and added it together. The same is true with strings. So if I were to make this like 2x and I put hello space, it would give me hello, hello. So when you do mathematical operations on variables, even if it's strings, it's actually going to basically just concatenate or just repeat what it is. So even though I've defined this as add numbers, it's still going to work with strings. Now, will it work if I do hello and an integer? You think that's going to work? Nope. Why? Because they aren't matching. So you can concatenate strings, you can concatenate integers and floats, you can concatenate floats and floats, integers and integers, but if you add these together, it's going to read this as an integer, it's going to read this as a string, and it's going to say, well, it's going to see the string, and it's going to say, I need to concatenate that. It's going to guess what it's going to try to do because it's going to be like, well, it's a string. I know I can't do a mathematical operation on it, so I'm going to concatenate it. But then it's not going to be able to interpret the integer as a string, so it's not going to concatenate that necessarily. So you would, in order for that to work, you would have to convert q into a string within the function, or you would have to define it as the string of q in the function call for it to work. So let's try that. Let's try to define q as a string first and see if it'll work in our function now. And it does. So if you actually wanted this number to work, but you didn't want to have to manipulate the function, you can actually edit that data and describe it as a string within your call, and it will work. So 12, hello 12. So these are some things to take into consideration when you're working with functions, is that when you're building a function and you want to manipulate certain different data sets, but you don't want to edit the entire function, it might be possible that in the call you can manipulate the data to be in the form you want it to be so that it runs through the function and gives you the output that you're looking for. So let's put this back to the way it was before. We're going to call this X and Y. And then we're going to make this X and Y. And so we get 12 again. Now, here's another function where I'm defining it as encourage, so I'm trying to encourage somebody. And then again, you can label this input whatever you want it to be, but it's highly encouraged that the input kind of indicates what you're asking for. So like if you were trying to find like the volume or a circumference of a circle, you might want to put like R or D as your diameter or radius, and then any other inputs that you might need. So if it's a cylinder, you might want the height as H or something like that. So in this case, what this function is doing is it's basically, I want it to give whoever the name you input some positive encouragement. So what it does is when you call this function, it's going to just print out "you are awesome," and then it's going to say whatever name you put in there. So if I want to encourage Sally, I call encourage Sally, and it prints out "you are awesome, Sally." So if I wanted to encourage Jim, I can say encourage Jim, and then it will say "you are awesome, Jim." Okay. So this will print out that statement. Now, one thing that's important, actually, I see stuff in the chat. Okay, so I was seeing the responses to guessing whether it would work or not. So I'm sorry I went away from this when you were asking about the strq. Would the hello world work? So are you saying if Q was world, but you called it a string? I think it would be fine because it would go from a string to a string. It wouldn't change anything. But anyways, one thing that's important is notice how in this function I have it printing, and in this one I have it returning. One of the key things when it comes to a function is if it's basically something that's strictly informational, where it's just going to output something and that's the end of it, making it a print statement is probably okay. The problem, though, is that if you want to create a function that's going to basically output some sort of data that you're going to use later, you want to have it return that information. So in the encouragement function, we're not really concerned about like data manipulation or numbers changing or using that for something else later on. We're just basically saying, okay, like it's a cute little print statement. But if we were using this add numbers function and we wanted to print out X plus Y, or have it print X plus Y. Oops, sorry. I need to put it in parentheses. It's still going to give us 12. But let's say that I want to create a new function let's say I want to create a new function that says multiply numbers x comma y, okay? And I want to return x times y. Well, what if I want to take the answer that I get in add numbers and make that one of my inputs? Do you think this is going to work? No, it's not. Now, why is that the case? Well, I might have done something wrong in the process, but the real reason why it's not working right now is because even though x and y are adding up in this function of add numbers, x and y are being added together, it's a print statement. So all it's doing is it's telling me what x plus y is, but it's not actually returning any sort of data. So the actual data that the function is returning is nothing. It's printing something, but it's not actually doing anything with that information. It's just basically running the process and it's not doing anything with it. If I instead change this to return, when I run the code block, it's still going to give me 12, but the difference is instead of it just printing out the number 12, it's actually printing out the number 12, but it's also returning me a piece of data that happens to be the integer 12. Whereas the other one's just a print statement, it's not actually returning any data. It's just a none. If you were to basically do a Boolean, it would be a false. So if I do a return instead of a print statement, it should be that if I do this, it should give me 60. And it does. Why is it giving me 60? Because my first input is 5, which is x, so that's going to be 5 times y. Well, what did I make y? I didn't make y a number. I made y the function add numbers with the inputs variable x and variable y. So variable x is 5, variable y is 7. So what it's going to do is it's going to first run this function. So it inputs 5 in for x, 7 for y. That gives me 12. Because I returned it as 12, it's now storing the integer 12 as the return, whereas if I was using print, it wasn't storing anything. And then when I run the second operation of x times y, it's now saying, okay, well, we knew x was 5 because you told me that. I ran this through the function. It got me 12. So now I'm going to do 5 times 12, and that gives me 60. So the cool thing about a function is an input could be another function that runs an operation that gives you the input that you're looking for. So we basically, with this one call, ran 2 different functions to get this operation. Does that make sense? Cool. And then this one, again, you're just printing this statement so it actually doesn't have any sort of data attached to it. So if I were to basically try to concatenate this, it won't give me anything. So if I were to say print str encourage Jim oops, there we go. It's printing it, but it's also saying none because it's saying, okay, well, the output is nothing because it's a print statement. But if instead I do return, it goes away. Does that make sense? So basically, when you print something, it's just doing the command operation as if it was just a regular block of code without a function. So if you say print 1, print 2, print 3, print 4, print 5, it's going to print everything that you tell it to print, assuming that it can actually do the operation, but it's not actually storing anything. So again, if I want the volume, I can do x, y, z, x times y times z. But again, if I wanted to make this that add numbers x, y again, it will do 1 times 2 times 12, which should give us 24. So again, you can run a function through another function and still get the output, so long as the functions that you're using before are returning something. If they're not returning something, you're going to get an error because of the fact that it's not any sort of data type. And so this one, I'm trying to figure out volume x number of q, 5, 1, 2, 3 times 5. Why isn't this one working? So I ran this, why isn't this working? Anyone want to guess? You can either drop in the chat, unmute, doesn't matter.
It's 1, 2, 3, and 4.
So for this one, I run it, it doesn't run. So if I define this, okay, it takes one input of Q. So I'm printing, and I want it to print out volume 1, 2, 3. So it's basically calling this function, running it through, then multiplying times the input I put in here. So if I do volume x num of 5, what I'm expecting it to do is it's supposed to do 1 times 2 times 3, then multiply it times whatever input I have, which is times 5. So that should be 1 times 2 times 3, which is 6, times 5, which is 30. But I'm getting an error.
Is it because you didn't define the function properly? You didn't add so you didn't have like an extra variable like a where Q is. So you'd have to have 2 arguments plugged in. Oh,
Well,
never mind.
yeah. See, if you look at the type error, you can see that where the issue is. So if you've ever noticed that you've gotten errors before, typically Python tries to guess why it's not working. It'll usually identify the row and line, and it will also give you a kind of a best guess of what's wrong. So it'll say it's wrong, but then it'll try to guess. So it's actually not that it's taking 2 arguments, it's actually that print return issue again in the previous definition or a previous function. So what happened is this isn't returning anything, it's just a print statement. So if I change this to return, I should get 30. There you go. So the trick for that one wasn't that the 2 arguments was the issue. So yes, you can actually within a function call another function within that function. You don't have to call it in the call outside of the function. You actually call it within the function. In fact, like a lot of programs have like 10 different functions. You're calling this function here, that function there, this function here, that function there to kind of return something more complicated. That's kind of where we're headed with this. But because, again, I didn't return anything here, it was a none statement. So it was like, oh, well, there's an error there. So I would almost always default to returning something versus printing something if you're going to plan on using it somewhere else. The other thing that's tricky with return statements is you can only return one thing. So if you want to return multiple things, you've got to basically make sure that you're defining that it's returning multiple things and make sure that whatever you're using it in can take those arguments on, or else you'll get errors. So you could have it return a tuple, you can have it return an item from a dictionary, you can have it return basically anything. But if you want it to return like multiple things that you're inputting into a new function, you want to make sure that those are clearly defined. So like you could be like, okay, I'm returning X and Y, and then X and Y goes into a new function as the input, and then you want to make sure that at least it's returning it in there, or else you'll get an error because you'll think you're sending two numbers, but you might be only sending one, depending on what you're doing. So for the remainder of class today, you have your weekly exercise. And so basically, I kind of wanted to um, give you insight as to what the exercise is. So I will share this with you in a second. But basically, your week 7 exercise is to create a dynamic pricing calculator.